Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yud Ches, Daf 18 of Masechta Beitzah. What can I tell you about Daf 18? So we start out with the new Mishnah. It talks really all about going to the Mikveh, people, vessels, things like that. We're going to see 4 different opinions about how come we do not put things into the Mikveh on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Why don't we tovel things on Shabbos and Yom Tov? That's kind of like the main kind of sugya on today's daf. So let's jump in here. And Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis at the Mishnah towards the bottom. Cholios acher Shabbos. Ho. So when Yom Tov falls out on Sunday, that sounds fun. Beis Shammai om matbilin es hakol milifnei Shabbos. So Beis Shammai says, well, everything needs to go to the mikveh before Shabbos. Everything being vessels. If you get a new bowl, let's say, for Shabbos and Yom Tov, so make sure that you bring that bowl to the mikveh on Friday already. And guess what? You should also go to the mikveh on Friday. Don't go to the mikveh on Shabbos and Yom Tov, according to Beis Shammai. Whereas Beis Hillel says, the vessels, you got to get into the mikveh. You got to tovel the kelim before Shabbos. But people can go to the mikveh on Shabbos and memela on Yom Tov. V'shavan shemeshikin es hamoyim b'chli even l'tayron avalo matbilin. That both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree shemeshikin es hamoyim b'chli even. Friends, what does that mean? L'maisa, can somebody explain this to me? Meshikin is basically if you have water, drinking water, and the water becomes tameh, so you want to make the water tahor, so you could drink it, assuming that you want to drink tahor water. So what you can do is that you could put it in a stone vessel, because stone is not makabel tumah, and then you leave the vessel open at the top, and then you dip the vessel into the water, so that the tameh water that you're going to drink ultimately touches the mikveh water, and now the mikveh water is, and now the water, the drinking water is now tahor water. Gevaldik, that's what hashaka is, kind of like connect the mikveh water to the tameh water. Now the tameh water becomes tahor. Aval lo matbilin, but you don't put them in the mikveh. What does that mean? It means that let's say you have a vessel that's tameh. So you say, hey, I'll feed 2 birds with 1 seed. I'll put my tameh water inside the tameh vessel. I'll then do ashake, because of course we know, both Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai agree that you're not allowed to put kelim in the mikveh on Shabbos and Yom Tov. But you think, I have a good idea. I'll just put my tameh water that I want to do ashake with into this tameh vessel. I'll dip the tameh vessel into the water into the mikveh in the context of the ashake, and then once the vessel is completely immersed in the mikveh and the mikveh waters touch the tameh waters, and now the tameh waters become tahor, memele the kli is entirely submerged in the mikveh waters, and now memele my tameh kli is now tahor. So the Gemara says, don't do that. Don't chaperayim. So while you're allowed to do ashake, you would not be allowed to use it as an opportunity to also tovel your tameh kli that you didn't get to before Shabbos. So don't do that, right? So we say, so v'shavin shemeshikin es hamoyim b'chli even the tyron. So Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that you'd be allowed to put the water, this tameh water that you want to make tahor by way of hashake, you could put it in a stone vessel, i.e. a vessel that is certainly going to be tahor, because stone even is not makabel tumah. So that's fine. Ve'ein matbilin, but avalo matbilin, but don't put this water in a tameh kli, so that in the course of the ashake you'll also memele be mitaher the kli. No, that no feeding 2 birds with 1 seed. Only 1 bird with 1 seed today. The Gemara is going to explain what this means, that you're allowed to be tovel from one to the other, and also from one group to another group. The Gemara is going to explain what that is, just not today. Okay, Says the Gemara, "D'chuli ama mias kli b'Shabbos lo." Okay, givaldi. So everyone agrees, though. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that you would not be allowed to take a kli, a vessel, to the mikveh on Shabbos or on Yom Tov. How come? Meaning we had a machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel about can people go to the mikveh. So Beis Shammai says no, Beis Hillel says yes. But they both agree that vessels cannot go to the mikveh on Shabbos or on Yom Tov. The question is, how come? My time, how come? Omer Rabba, says Rabba, what do you guys think Rabba says? Rabba's opinion when it comes to lulav, when it comes to shofar, megillah, things like that, is the gzera de Rabba. That, okay, over there you're worried about going to the expert, whatever it is. But Rabba says here also, he's also concerned that if you could take vessels to the mikveh, well, how are they going to get to the mikveh? You might end up carrying these vessels that you're taking to the mikveh 4 amas in Rishus Harabim, and Memela, we don't want you to do that. Says Abaye, yeah, okay, but what if you have a mikveh in your chatzar and you don't have to go to Rishus Harabim? So then can you take your kelim to the mikveh in your chatzar? To which Rabbah says, well, we nonetheless make a gezerah, that even if you have a mikveh in your chatzar, so memele there's no issue of carrying Daled Amos from Rishus Harabim. However, we make a gezerah nonetheless and say that even when you have a mikveh in your chatzar, still do not use it out of concern for for situations where you don't have a mikveh in your chatzar and you have to use the mikveh in the public domain, where you might end up carrying in Rishus Harabim. Matinach Shabbos b'Yom Tov ma'ikil meima. To which Abai says, okay, but still, carrying, as we know at this point in Masechta Beya, carrying Daled Amos of Rishus Harabim is an issue on Shabbos, but it's not an issue on Yom Tov. Right? We said since it's permitted for Ochel Nefesh, it's permitted for anything. So carrying my vessels to take it to the mikveh on Yom Tov shouldn't be a problem, according to Rabbi, who says that the only issue is carrying. So Gazu Yom Tov atu Shabbos. So they say, well, we make a gezerah on Yom Tov because of Shabbos. Now this is already getting interested. To which Abai says, like, what's the deal? That's totally a gezerah, right? Kilu. We're saying, even if I have on Yom Tov, don't take kelim to the mikveh even though I'm allowed to carry on Yom Tov, so there really isn't any concern. But then you might end up doing it on Shabbos. And on Shabbos, we're only concerned, I can't even do it in my own private chatzar out of concern that I might do it in the Rishus Harabim. So let's say I have a mikveh, my own private chatzar, and it's Yom Tov. So you're going to tell me that I can't take any kelim to my own private mikveh, my own private kelim mikveh in my chatzar on Yom Tov out of a gezerah because of Shabbos, which in and of itself is only a gezerah out of a situation where I don't have a mikveh in my own private property, and I might end up carrying Rishus Harabim. We're getting kind of far away from the mark over here. We learn in a Mishnah, we said in our Mishnah that both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that you would be allowed to do ashake, you would be allowed to submerge a stone vessel that has tamei water in it into a mikveh in order to make the water tahor. But don't put it in a tamei vessel so that you can also feed 2 birds with 1 seed and make the tamei vessel tahor as well. And Rabbah, if it's true that we're in gezerah land, that we make all sorts of gezerahs, make a gezerah from Shabbos, from Yom Tov to Shabbos, from Rishus Hayachid to Rishus Harabim, well then, nigzor ashake atu atbala. Well then we should say, right, instead of saying that while you're allowed to do ashake in a stone evan, in a stone kli, you're not allowed to do ashake in a regular kli that's tamei. Shouldn't we say that, well, since you're not allowed to do ashake in a kli that's tameh, then also you're not allowed to do hashaka even in a stone kli out of a gezerah. After all, if we're making all sorts of gezerahs when it comes to putting things in the mikveh, why, we should make this gezerah as well. That you're not allowed to do hashaka in a stone vessel out of concern that you might do it in a non-stone vessel that's tameh. V'tizbira. But then to which Rabbi responds, he says that's not really a good question because Rabbi says, well, what are we talking about in the first place? If the fellow had delicious tahor drinking water, he wouldn't be getting himself involved in this whole ashaka headache to begin with. It must mean that he doesn't have delicious, available, pure drinking water. And he's only doing ashake and putting his drinking water in the mikveh because this is all he's got. And therefore, since he doesn't have any other water, the Mele is going to try to be as careful with this drinking water as he can. Meaning, when all you have is this water, is this like bit of water, and you don't have any other water, so you're going to do whatever you can to make sure that they don't become tummy in the first place. And therefore, since when all you have is this water, and you're going to be doing whatever you can to make sure that they don't become tummy in the first place, so you don't have to do this hashaka thing, that means that memele, the situation that we're talking about with hashaka, with where you're going to have to bring the water to the mikveh in this stone vessel, is something that's not very common. And because it's something that's not very common, the rabbis didn't make their gezerah in this case to say, well, we should make a gezerah by stone vessels out of concern for situations when you use other kinds of vessels. So because in this particular situation, since this is the only water that he has, and Mamele is going to be careful with them to begin with, so the chances of having the situation of hashake in a stone vessel is not particularly common, and because it's not particularly common, so the rabbis didn't make a gezerah, as opposed to just regular putting things in the mikveh. That's a relatively common thing. I don't take things to the mikveh like that so often, but I know of people who probably do. Eisvei. Abai asks another kasha. Medalin b'dli tame v'hu tor me'elav. So we have a Beitzah that says that let's say you have a bucket for episode well, and the bucket is tame. So we say that you'd be allowed to fill up on Shabbos this bucket. You can use it in the well, to chuck it into the well and fill up water, even though memela, that means that you can be submerging it in the water and it's going to become tahor. Right, so again, madlim b'dli tame v'hu tahor me'elav. So you can use this bucket for the well that's tame, even though memela, it means that it's going to become tahor when it gets submerged in the well water. Okay? V'isa nigzor dam asilat bule be'ene. Now, if we're in gezerah mode, well then shouldn't we be concerned that you might just take this bucket and just tovel it in the mikveh? If you're allowed to, if we say, look, you're allowed to use it as a bucket in a well, and that's okay, shouldn't we be concerned with? But then he might just end up taking the bucket and just putting it in the mikveh to begin with. Shani asum mitoch shlohutulo ella al yidei dalyo zacharu. Which the Gemara says, no, in that particular case, since it's only allowed in this particular manner, using it as a bucket in a well, so, he's gonna remember that, look, it's only allowed in this particular way, as a bucket in a well, I wouldn't be allowed to actually take it and put it in the mikveh. Eisvei. Then Abai asks the kasha to Rabba, Kli shenitma me'erev yomtiv, ein matbilin also be yomtiv. Okay, so we see that. So we see that a vessel that became tamei on erev yomtiv, ein matbilin also be yomtiv. You're not allowed to put it in the mikveh on yomtiv. You should have put it in the mikveh before yomtiv. But yomtiv matbilin also be yomtiv. But if it became tamei on yomtiv, so then beseder you could put it in the mikveh on yomtiv. No big deal, and then you can use it for the rest of Yom Tov, as Rashi points out that for Chulin, you don't need Harav Shemesh or anything like that. And you can use it already that day. So if the vessel became Tamei on Yom Tov, you put it in the mikveh on Yom Tov, and you can use it for the rest of the day. Vim Isa. And if we're worried about gezeres, nigzor de yom tiv atu de erev yom tiv. Well, if we said that a vessel that became tamei on erev yom tiv, you have to put in the mikveh before yom tiv begins. You cannot put it in the mikveh on yom tiv. But if the vessel becomes tamei on yom tiv, so you could put it in the mikveh on yom tiv. But shouldn't we make a gezerah that even when it becomes tamei on yom tiv, you're still not allowed to put it in the mikveh because of a situation when it became tamei before yom tiv, where you're not allowed to put it in the mikveh on yom tiv? So, and for the Gemara, Tuma b'yom tiv milsad lo shchicha he milsad lo shchicha lo gazu barabonon. To which the Gemara answers, look, when it comes to the shalosh regalim, everyone's going to the mikveh, everyone's becoming pure beforehand, before yom tiv, and therefore everyone's going to be super alert to make sure that they remain pure, and that their vessels remain pure, and that everything's pure. And therefore, a vessel becoming impure on yom tiv is something that is uncommon. And since it's uncommon, the rabbis did not feel the need to make a gezerah in that context. And therefore, if a vessel becomes something on Yom Tiv, you can put it in the mikveh on Yom Tiv, even though if it would become tamei before Yom Tiv, you would not be allowed to put it in the mikveh on Yom Tiv. Eisvei, ba'yasra ba'akasha, kli shenitma ba'avatuma. So if you have a vessel that became tamei from a avatuma, okay, so an avatuma is metame kelim, to be a rishon, so it's a rishon l'tuma midoraisa. Eimat bilin also be Yom Tiv, so you wouldn't be allowed to put it into the mikveh on Yom Tiv. Bivlada tuma, meaning assuming that it became tamei before Yom Tiv. Bivlada tuma, mat bilin also be Yom Tiv. But if the vessel became tamei from a vlada tuma, you could put it in the mikveh on Yom Tiv. Now, mida oraisa, a vessel is not able to become tamei from a vlada tuma, right? Right? Adam and Kalim are only become tamei from, in Ava Tuma and above. So Mida Oraisa, a Vlada Tuma, such as a Rishon Tuma, cannot be Metame another Kli. However, I don't remember, did we learn maybe in Masechta Psachim or something, that a Kli that's a Rishon could make another Kli, a Sheni Midrabanan? I can't remember. It kind of rings a bell, but I can't really remember. But anyways, that does seem one way or another to be what we're talking about over here, that a vessel that became a sheni, that became tamei from a rishon l'tuma, which mida oraisa is tahor, but mida rabbanon is tamei. So we say what? Pivlada tuma matbilin also be Yom Tiv, that you can put in the mikvah on Yom Tiv. Vim isa. And if we're in gezerah mode, well then, shouldn't we say nigzor ha'atuha? Shouldn't we say that a vessel that became tamei from a vlada tuma, shouldn't we say that a vessel that became tamei from a vlada tuma, that is only tamei midor rabbanon, you should nonetheless not be allowed to put in the mikveh on Yom Tiv out of concern that, well, you're not allowed to put a vessel that became tamei from an avatuma in the mikveh on Yom Tiv. So, and for the Gemara, vlada tuma eichi mishkachas lo gabi kanim ziyuzin heim. To which the Gemara answers that, well, to who is these kalim really relevant? To Kohanim, right? Meaning, if we're talking about kalim, that midrabanan became tamei from a rishon l'tuma, that makes them a sheni l'tuma. So sheni l'tuma is metame truma kodshim, and therefore that's only relevant to Kohanim who are eating truma and kodshim, and therefore the Kohanim are particularly zrizim. They're detailed and very on top of the mitzvahs and stuff. And therefore, we're not super concerned that the Kohanim are going to end up putting in avatum and something that became tamei from an avatum in the mikvah, because we're talking about Kohanim, they know the difference. We don't have to make this gezerah for the Kohanim specifically. Additionally, an alternative answer that Rashi gives is that, well, because the Kohanim are particularly careful, this whole context becomes something that is not common. And if it's uncommon, then the rabbis didn't feel the need to make a gzera. Okay, fine. That sounds very nice. Interesting. If you have a nida who has to go to the mikveh, okay, fine, and she doesn't have pure clothing, she doesn't have Torah clothing to change into afterwards, all she has is tamei clothing. So then, says Rav Chiya bar Ashi in the name of Rav, What she can do is, now she can't put her clothing in the mikveh because clothing are kelim, and we said that you can't put kelim in the mikveh on Shabbos or Yom Tov. What she could do is, she could jump in the mikveh with her clothing. Now I don't know about chatzitzas and stuff, but she could jump in the mikveh with her clothing, and then memele, you know what she can do? Oh, this is probably the point, is that maybe she's not going to the mikveh. Meaning, she could jump in because, okay. Yeah, because we're going to see later on that it could just look like she's cooling down, I think. So, she could jump in the mikveh, because she's just like cooling down or whatever. Then memele, her clothing is in the mikveh, and her clothing becomes tahor. So now her clothing is tahor, and then once her clothing is tahor, so then I guess she now has tahor clothing, and so even though she can't put her clothing directly into the mikveh, she could jump into the mikveh with her clothing, and then her clothing will become tahor. Problem solved. Okay, fine. Although I think Rashi seems to be saying that actually the tefillah does work for her as well. So it seems like she's feeding two birds with one seed. So I don't know about chatzitzas and stuff like that. But we're saying that even though her clothing she would not be able to put directly into the mikveh, because clothing are kelim, and kelim you cannot put into the mikveh on Yom Tif, of course, as we're learning about. So, but what she could do is she could jump into the mikveh and feed two birds with one seed. She'll be tahor, as well as her clothing will be tahor. Fine, vim isa, but if we're concerned about gezeres, shouldn't we be concerned that if she can put her clothing in the mikveh in this way, then she might end up just putting her clothing in the mikveh directly, which is not allowed? To which the Gemara answers, no, it's different over there, that, since the only way that the clothing are allowed to go into the mikveh is in this particular way, that she jumps in inner clothing, so then it's clear that only in this particular way is it allowed. She won't end up just putting her clothing in the mikveh straight. Okay, sounds very nice. So where are we at? Basically, we have the opinion of Rabbah that the reason why you're not allowed to put things in the mikveh on Shabbos, on Yom Tov, is because out of concern of carrying Dalet Amos from Rishus HaRabim. We asked about all these questions, right? What about in situations where it's irrelevant? And we say it's ultimately then a gezerah. And then we challenge that by saying, there are other situations where you're allowed to put things in the context of mikveh that we don't make gezerahs. And we answered each one of those. So to get back to where we started, Rabbah says that ultimately the reason why we do not tovel things in the mikveh on Shabbos and Yom Tov is ultimately a concern out of carrying Dalet Amos b'Rishus HaRabim. Rav Yosef had gesagt, Gzeira mishum schita, that the concern is schita, that if you could put kelim in the mikveh, now kelim includes clothing are kelim. Now if you could put kelim in the mikveh, you might end up wringing them out. And schita is a tolada of mefarek, dash, whatever it is. I think dash is a tolada of mefarek. Omele Abaye, tenach kelim divnei schita nenu, kelim dilav bnei schita nenu ma'ikil meimar. To which Abaye asks Rav Yosef, it says, that makes sense in the context of things that you could wring out. What about kelim that you cannot wring out? What about a bowl? You don't wring out a bowl. Why can't I put that in the mikveh? Omele gzerahani atuani. To which Rav Yosef says, out of a gezerah, that, we're concerned that if you put the bowl in the mikveh, you might end up putting clothing in the mikveh and wringing out the clothing. To which Abai then asked Rav Yosef all of the questions that he asked Rabbah about, do we really make gezerahs? And Rav Yosef answered all of them like Rabbah did, answered why all those concerns weren't concerns. So Beitzah Omar, gezerah shemiyashe, or Rav Beitzah says, how come you're not allowed to put vessels in the mikveh on Yom Tiv? Well, because we're concerned, if you could put vessels in the mikveh on Yom Tiv, then you might just wait for Yom Tiv, right? So let's say you have a vessel that became tameh. And you say, okay, I have to take this vessel to the mikveh. Now, I don't know about you, but I feel like taking kelim to the mikveh is something that could sometimes not be at the top of your fun list. So you might push it off. Now, if you know that on Yom Tiv you're allowed to take vessels to the mikveh, you might say, let me just wait till Yom Tiv. As Rashi says, Yom Tiv shehu panui, that on Yom Tiv you have plenty of time. I experienced this recently on Rosh Hashanah. There was plenty of time. It's very interesting. I'm not used to having plenty of time. But on Rosh Hashanah, I already prepared Babylon Talmud on Shabbos. And then whatever was left, I already had done on over Rosh Hashanah. And then I actually had some time. It was an interesting thing. And so says Rav Beitzah, Yom Tov is the kind of thing where you can end up with some extra time on your hands. And you might then say, I'll use that time to chaparayim and to bring my vessels to the mikveh. And what'll end up happening is that you're going to keep these bowls and things around that are tameh, because you're waiting for Yom Tov when you'll have some extra time and you'll bring it to the mikveh. And that you don't want to keep things that are tameh around, because then, truma could become other things could end up becoming tameh. So Rav Beitzah says the reason why we don't put vessels in the mikveh on Yom Tov is because we're concerned that if that's the case, you might end up waiting for Yom Tov to take things to the mikveh, which means that you'll end up leaving around tamei things, and we don't want that. Tana Kavasa de Rav Beitzah, we have a brisa supporting Rav Beitzah, Klishanitma me'erev Yom Tov, that if you have a vessel that became tamei on erev Yom Tov, ein madbilin also be Yom Tov, so you don't put it in the mikveh on Yom Tov. How come? Because there is shemayasha, out of concern for people specifically end up leaving vessels for Yom Tov, so that they'll go to the mikveh then on Yom Tov, and then they'll have tamei vessels waiting around, which is not something that we want. Rav Omar, this is probably the most famous of all of the answers, I think, which is that out of concern for being misakin kli, that a vessel that's tamei is like unusable, and by putting it in the mikveh, you're now fixing it. And that's like a makabeh patish kind of thing, right? We don't fix things on Yom Tov, on Shabbos and Yom Tov. So Rav Amar P'nishinir K'Misakin Kli, that by putting a vessel in the mikveh, it's like you're fixing it's like you're fixing it. Well, if that's the case, then a fellow is tamei, he's like incomplete. He goes to the mikveh, now he's complete, now he's fixed. Uwah. So if that's the case, then a fellow shouldn't go to the mikveh on Shabbos and Yom Tov either. He's fixing himself. So Adam Nira Kimekar. So the Gemara answers, well, a fellow, he might just look like he's cooling down, not necessarily fixing himself in the mikveh. That makes sense. If you're in a beautiful pool, or a beautiful body of water, what if you're in a putrid body of water? Why would you be going to a putrid body of water? Why would you jump into a putrid body of water? Because it's a kosher mikveh. It's a kosher mikveh, so then it's clear that you're only going for the mikveh and you're fixing yourself. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak paimim shadam ba ba'asharav v'rochetz afilu b'mei mishra. Rav Nachman says, look, there are situations where people can even cool themselves off in putrid waters. If it's a heat wave and they didn't have air conditioning back then, and maybe he didn't have some hot water to make himself a hot drink to cool down, so he says, let me jump into water, even though it's water that they soak flax in, which apparently is not the most refreshing water, but nonetheless, it can happen that a person can jump into water that might not be top notch. And therefore, that's why you can go to the mikveh. A fellow can go to the mikveh on Shabbos and Yom Tov because it just looks like he's cooling down. Okay, so this is very nice in the summer, where maybe jumping in the water is very refreshing. What about in the winter when it's freezing cold outside and you're jumping into the water? Memele, you're going to the mikveh, no? So says Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, look, it can happen in the winter as well. A fellow is absolutely, filthy. He could jump into the water even during the winter. So again, even if somebody sees you in the body of water in the winter, it could be that you're just kind of, not necessarily fixing yourself, but maybe you had to jump in for other reasons. Okay, that's fine. This makes sense on Shabbos. What about on Yom Kippur? You can't just jump into a body of water on Yom Kippur to cool, to enjoy yourself. So if that's the case, so Memela, why are you going to this body of water on Yom Kippur? To fix yourself. Shouldn't that be a problem? Says Rave, well, we can't have a situation that something would be permitted on Shabbos and also on Yom Kippur when it comes to malacha. If we're saying that you're not allowed to go to the mikveh, meaning if we would be saying that on Shabbos we're not concerned that going to the mikveh is going to be a problem of fixing yourself, because we could say Nira Kemaker, he's just cooling himself down. So we're not concerned about the malacha of Makeh B'Patish. We're not concerned on Shabbos that you're fixing yourself. So does it make sense to say that on Yom Kippur we're going to be concerned about a malacha that we're not concerned about Shabbos? No, if on Shabbos we're not concerned about this malacha, so then on Yom Kippur we're also not going to be concerned about the malacha. Since we're not concerned about fixing yourself on Shabbos, we're also not concerned about fixing yourself in this manner on Yom Kippur, and therefore you can go to the mikveh even on Yom Kippur. But does Rava really hold of Ho'il? Meaning Rava had just said, well, since it's allowed on Shabbos, therefore it's also allowed on Yom Kippur. When it comes to Malacha on Shabbos, does Rava really hold of this since principle? But we learn in a Mishnah, a fellow, if his teeth are bothering him, he shouldn't sip vinegar. Because, why is he sipping vinegar? It must be, who's going to sip vinegar? Memele, he has a toothache. And he's doing this as a refuah. And we know that refuah is also midrabanan because of shchika samamon. Aval, metabalu kedarkov nisapa. But you could dip things into vinegar. And then if memele, the vinegar helps out for your teeth, so givaldig. But you can't sip vinegar directly, because that would be clear that you're doing it for refuah. V'amina nalom, we ask the kasha, ligameh ufole, avim ligameh ufole. We have a kasha, that we have a brayso that says, that don't sip and spit, but you can sip and swallow. Givaldig. Meaning, there's a way that you're allowed to sip vinegar on Shabbos to benefit your teeth. And that is, if you sip it and swallow it, so then it's okay. If you sip it and spit it out, so then why are you doing that? Clearly you're trying to fix your teeth, and that'll be a problem with refuah. But if you sip it and swallow it, then it's okay. So how come, on the one hand, we're saying that you're not allowed to sip vinegar? You can only, have it sort of in the context of dipping, so that it's not clear that it's for refuah. Yet we also say, wait, you actually are allowed to sip vinegar as long as you swallow it. So Abai says, well, when the Mishnah says that you're not allowed to spit, that you're not allowed to sip, rather you can just eat it like by dipping, so that means that you're not allowed to sip and spit. Instead, dip. But sip and swallow would be acceptable. Whereas Rava says, Rava says you can even say that when the Mishnah says that you're not allowed to sip, rather you have to dip, that could even be talking about sipping and swallowing. Well, what's the problem with that? The answer is, depends if he's already eaten. If he hasn't yet already eaten, so then he could sip and swallow. No problem, and it doesn't look so crazy. He hasn't eaten yet. So he's, maybe he's getting ready to eat, whatever it is. He's sipping some vinegar. Sounds interesting. But once he's already eaten, even sipping and swallowing is not allowed because you've already eaten. Why are you sipping vinegar? It must be that you have a toothache. V'im isa, and if it's true that Rava holds of this principle of Ho'il, that since one thing is permitted, therefore something else is permitted, well then, Nema Ho'il v'kodem tibul shari, lachar tibul nami shari. Well then why doesn't Rava say that, well, since he's allowed to sip and swallow before eating, he should be allowed to sip and swallow after eating as well. Just like he says that, well, since you're allowed to go to the mikveh on Shabbos and it's no problem, you're also allowed to go to the mikveh on Yom Kippur and it's no problem. So you should say that since you're allowed to sip and swallow before eating, you should be able to sip and swallow after eating. Oichit. So the Gemara answers that Rava was chayzer. He changed his mind, he retracted. Retracted from what? Retracted from the vinegar thing. That meaning initially he had explained that when we say that you're not allowed to sip the vinegar, it's talking about after eating. And when you're allowed to sip and swallow, it's talking about before eating. But then what about Ho'il? So we say that Rava later jumped on the Ho'il train, on the since train, and once he jumped on the since train, right, it doesn't really rhyme, but once you since, you never go back. Since would have to rhyme with ak, probably, for that to work. So once Rava jumped on the since train and says, well, since on Shabbos you're allowed to go to the mikveh, so then also on Yom Kippur you're allowed to go to the mikveh. So also he would say that since you can sip vinegar before you eat, you can also sip vinegar and swallow it after you eat. So then how do you explain the Mishnah that says that you're not allowed to sip vinegar, you have to dip it? It means you're not allowed to sip it and spit it out. But if you want to swallow it, gizun tehei. How do you know that Rava changed his mind against Ho'il, against saying since? Maybe he changed his mind. I don't know what I just said. How do I know that Rava changed his mind to say Ho'il, right? And therefore, rejecting the initial answer that we said that when you're not allowed to sip, it's talking about before eating, when you're not allowed to sip, it's talking about after eating. When you are allowed to sip, it's talking about before eating, right? Initially, that's what we want to say, that according to Rava, before he eats, he's allowed to sip and swallow. After he eats, he's not allowed to sip and swallow. And then we said, yeah, but what about Ho'il? And we say, oh yeah, you're right. How do you know? Wait, maybe Ho'il, maybe he changed his mind against saying Ho'il. And maybe the correct answer, according to Rava, is that, in fact, before you eat, you're allowed to sip and swallow. After you eat, you're not allowed to sip and swallow. He doesn't say Ho'il. So, you can't say that because we have a Beitzah that says, that anybody who needs to go to the mikveh can go to the mikveh on Tisha B'Av, on Yom Kippur, and it's no problem. Which means that Memele, we have a Beitzah that says that on Yom Kippur, you're allowed to go to the mikveh. Well, how is that allowed? It's only allowed if you say since. That's since, meaning because you're clearly not going to cool down on Yom Kippur, so you're definitely going to the mikveh. What about Misakin? It's a good question. But since it's allowed on Shabbos, and we don't say it's an issue of Misakin, so therefore on Yom Kippur as well, you're allowed to go to the mikveh. So certainly it's clear that when it comes to Yom Kippur, when it comes to Shabbos and Yom Kippur and going to the mikveh, we say Ho'il. And therefore, since we say Ho'il there, we're also going to say the same thing also by the vinegar, and say that since he's allowed to sip and swallow before he eats, he's also allowed to sip and swallow after he eats. And therefore, how do you understand the Beitzah that says that you're not allowed to sip, you have to dip, and the Beitzah that says, well, you're allowed to sip and swallow? So Rava's going to have to answer like Abaye, that when it says that you're not allowed to sip, it means you're not allowed to sip and spit, but you would be allowed to sip and swallow. Very, very beautiful sugya of Gemara. The Mishnah then said that both Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that you're allowed to do ashake. That if you have water that is tameh and you want to make it tar, so you could touch the tameh waters to the waters of a mikveh, and then the tameh waters become tar. However, they agree that it would have to be done in a stone vessel. You wouldn't be able to do it in, let's say, a wooden vessel that became tameh, that you would also then be able to feed two birds with one seed and dip the tameh vessel into the mikveh at the same time that you do the ashaka, and memele, you fed two birds with one seed. You made the water tahor, and you also made the vessel tahor as well. So we say don't do that, right? You're only allowed to do it in a stone vessel, not in, let's say, a tameh wooden vessel. My avalo matbilin amr Shmuel in matbilin esakli al gav mem of the tyro biyomtiv. Okay, so says Shmuel that what does it mean that we don't dip in the mikveh? What it means, as we were just discussing, it means that while you're allowed to use a stone vessel, which will not become tameh at all, you would not be allowed to use it as an opportunity to dip a tameh vessel into the mikveh to make it tahor. You can do ashaka, but you cannot do hatbala. Fine. Okay, Mani Mas Nisan. So now, Frekti Gemara, who's the author of our Mishnah? That our Mishnah kind of has a hybrid opinion. Our Mishnah says that you're allowed to do ashaka, you're not allowed to do atbala. You're allowed to touch these tameh waters, the tar waters, to make the tameh waters tar, but you would not be allowed to do it in a vessel that needs to go to the mikveh. You can do hashaka, you cannot do hadbala. So Mani Masnisin, whose opinion is that? Lo Rebbe v'lo Rabbanan. It's neither the opinion of Rebbe, nor is it the opinion of Rabbanan. The Tanya is we learn in the Beitzah, ein matbilin es akli al gabe meimav l'tayro. You're not allowed to basically stick a vessel in a mikveh to make it Torah on Yom Tov, even in the context of hashaka. Well, in order to make it Torah, it doesn't say if it's Shabbos or Yom Tov. And you can't do hashaka either. That's Rebbe's opinion. So Rebbe's opinion is you can't do either one. You can't do hadbala, and you can't do hashaka either. You can't do anything. Our Mishnah said you're allowed to do hashaka. And the Chacham say not only are you allowed to do hashaka, you can even do hadbala in this manner. If you have these tamei waters that you want to make Torah by hashaka, so you could put it in a tamei vessel and put that and then do hashaka that way. And memela, the tamei vessel then becomes Torah. So again, our Mishnah says that you're allowed to do hashaka, you're not allowed to do hadbala. Rebbe says you're not allowed to do hashaka nor hadbala, and the Chachamim say you're allowed to do both. You're allowed to do hashaka and hadbala. So who is our Mishnah like? It's like neither Rebbe nor the Rabbanan. So Mani, Rebbe kasha hashaka. If we want to say our Mishnah is Rebbe, well, what about the fact that Rebbe says that hashaka is not allowed, and our Mishnah says hashaka is allowed? Rabbanan kasha hadbala. And if it's the rabbis, what about the fact that our Mishnah says hadbala is not allowed, and the rabbis say hadbala is allowed? Ibaisema Rebbe, Ibaisema Rabbanan, to which the Gemara says, look, I can answer either way, either for the rabbis or for the Rabbanan. Ibaisema Rebbe. If you want to say that our Mishnah is Rebbe, okay, well, if that's the case, well then, how come our Mishnah says that you're allowed to do hashaka? Rebbe says you're not allowed to do hashaka. And for the Gemara, Reisha de Beitzah b'yomtiv v'seifa b'shabbos v'chul masnisim b'yomtiv. Okay. So, if we look at the Beitzah, what does it say? Ein matbilin es akli al gav meimav l'tayro. So it says that you're not allowed, right? The Mishnah, right? The Beitzah had said that Rebbe's opinion is that you're not allowed to do hadbala. You're not allowed, if you have some water that needs to go, that's tamei, you want to do hashaka, you cannot do that in a, let's say, a wooden vessel that's tamei that needs to go to the mikveh. You would not be allowed to do that, and that's even on Yom Tov. And then he continues and he says, "Ve'ein mashikin es hamayim b'chli even l'taron," and you're not allowed to do hashaka even in a stone vessel. That's talking about on Shabbos. On Shabbos we're more stringent. You're not allowed to do hashaka in a stone vessel. But v'chulu masnisin b'yom tiv, says the Gemara. But our Mishnah is talking about on Yom Tiv. And therefore, when our Mishnah says that you are allowed to do hashaka, that's on Yom Tiv. So when the Beitzah says you're not allowed to do hashaka according to Rebbe, that's on Shabbos. When the Mishnah says, right, okay, so that's on Shabbos, that's when you're not allowed to do it. Now, our Mishnah is entirely talking about on Yom Tiv. And therefore it says that you are allowed to do hashaka. But even on Yom Tiv, Rebbe would say that you're not allowed to do hadbala. And therefore he says that that's why our Mishnah says, so our Mishnah is Rebbe, and our Mishnah says that you're not allowed to do hadbala, but you are allowed to do hashaka, because our Mishnah is talking about on Yom Tiv, where you're allowed to do hashaka, but you're not allowed to do hadbala, according to Rebbe. Or you could say that it's talking about the opinion of the rabbis, and therefore they would say that the Beitzah is talking about on Yom Tiv, and therefore, and the rabbis would say on Yom Tiv you're allowed to do hashaka and hadbala, and our Mishnah is talking about on Shabbos, where you're allowed to do hashaka according to the rabbis on Shabbos, but you would not be allowed to do hadbala. Alright, very good. Very, very nice. Friends, that was daf Yud Ches of Masechta Beya. I think it was a somewhat interesting daf. We gave 4 reasons for why you're not allowed to put vessels in the mikveh on why Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that you're not allowed to put vessels in the mikveh on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Rabba's opinion is because we're concerned that you might end up carrying 4 amas in Rishus HaRabim. Rav Yosef is concerned you might end up wringing out the vessels, to which we said, wait, but what about vessels that you don't wring out? Well, it's a gezerah because of the vessels that you do wring out. And we got into the whole question of gezeras and in what ways do they apply. Okay, fine. Then we saw the opinion of Beitzah, which is that, well, we're concerned that if you can take things to the mikveh on Yom Tov, you might end up leaving your vessels for Yom Tov, and then you're going to have tamei things around, and we don't want tamei things to be around. And Rava says, I think the sort of most well-known opinion, which is, well, it's like you're fixing something, right? That if you have a vessel that's tamei and you put it in the mikveh, it's like you're fixing something. Then the shaila is, well, then a person also, aren't you fixing yourself? We say, no, it seems like it looks like you can make the argument that you're really just cooling down. So, okay, what about Yom Kippur when you don't just cool down in water on Yom Kippur? Well, we say that since it's allowed on Shabbos, it's also allowed in Yom Kippur. We're not going to have something that is more, that we're not concerned about the malacha of Mesakin on Shabbos, and yet we are concerned about it on Yom Kippur. So therefore, Ho'il, since it's allowed on Shabbos, it's also allowed on Yom Kippur. We then ask Kashas, wait, does Rava really hold of Ho'il? We ended up saying that, yes, he does hold of Ho'il, and in that context we saw that about sipping vinegar on Shabbos for refuah, because in general you would not be allowed to do refuah on Shabbos because of a gezerah of chopping up spices for refuahs. So we say though that you would be allowed to sip vinegar as long as you swallow it, just don't spit it out, because then it would be clear that it's talking that you're doing it for refuah. And then we explained our Mishnah that, our Mishnah says that you are allowed to do ashake on Yom Tov, but not hatbala. We say, wait, who's that like? Because Rabbi seems to be saying that you're allowed to do neither ashake nor hatbala. The Chacham seems to be saying that you could do both. We say, well, it could be either Rabbi or the rabbis. That our Mishnah is that you could say it's Rabbi, and our Mishnah is talking about on Yom Tov. And because it's Yom Tov, you're allowed to do ashake, but you're not allowed to do hatbala. And you could say that Rebbe in the Beitzah, when he says that you are not allowed to do hashaka, that's talking about on Shabbos. Or you could say that our Mishnah is the rabbis, that our Mishnah is talking about on Shabbos, and that's why you're not allowed to do hatbala, but you still are allowed to do hashaka. And in the Beitzah, they're talking about Yom Tov, we're allowed to do hatbala and hashaka. Alright, that sounds like fun stuff. Friends, I hope you enjoyed Daf Yud Ches of Masechta Beitzah. Hope you enjoy your day. Cheers.